On a cold November morning in Detroit, the most powerful billionaire in Michigan thought he had seen everything money could buy and destroy. Richard Hallstrom had crushed entire families, closed factories without a second thought, and built his empire on the suffering of those he considered beneath him. But nothing could have prepared him for the moment. A 10-year-old boy on metal crutches emerged from an angry crowd and spoke words that would shatter his world forever. This crippled child knew impossible secrets about Richard's most guarded pain, his daughter's mysterious illness that had left her in a coma for weeks. With doctors declaring there was no hope left, the boy made an offer that defied all logic, $1 million in exchange for a miracle that seemed absolutely impossible. What Richard didn't know was that this wasn't about money at all. It was about a debt written in blood, a father's death, and a child's quest for justice that would force the most heartless man in Detroit to choose between his pride and everything he truly loved. The price of this miracle would be higher than anyone could imagine, and the final revelation would leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, redemption, and the true cost of second chances. Don't forget to follow our channel for more incredible stories that will touch your heart. Hit that like button if this story moved you, and comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our amazing community around the world. The grey November morning in Detroit felt like death itself had settled over the city. Outside the rusted gates of Hallstrom Manufacturing, nearly 300 workers pressed against the chain-link fence, their breath forming desperate clouds in the frigid air. They clutched termination letters that had arrived just 48 hours earlier, pink slips that would destroy families before Christmas, signed by a man who had never worked a day in his life. The crowd's anger was palpable, a living thing that seemed to pulse with each shout of murderer and blood money. These weren't just employees. They were third-generation factory workers whose grandfathers had built this place with their bare hands, whose children had grown up believing they'd follow in the same footsteps. Now, at 57 years old, men like Tommy Richardson stood there knowing no one would hire them again. Then the sound cut through the chaos, the low, arrogant purr of a Bentley Continental GT, black as midnight and worth more than most of these people would see in a lifetime. The crowd parted instinctively, hatred radiating from every face as the car rolled to a stop just yards from the factory entrance. Richard Hallstrom stepped out, his $1,000 Italian shoes touching the cracked asphalt like a king surveying conquered territory. At 45, he was tall, sharp-featured, with silver threading through his dark hair in a way that made him look distinguished rather than old. His navy cashmere coat probably cost more than these workers made in 6 months. He didn't just ignore their poverty, he seemed to feast on it. "Killer!" screamed Maria Santos, a single mother of 3 whose husband had died in a workplace accident that Richard's lawyers had somehow made disappear. "You're killing this city." Richard's response was worse than anger. It was amusement. His lips curved into a smile that never reached his cold blue eyes as he surveyed the desperate faces around him. "If you'd worked harder instead of demanding handouts, perhaps you'd still have jobs," he called out, his voice carrying that particular brand of cruelty that only comes from never having struggled for anything. The crowd surged forward, held back only by security guards who looked uncomfortable enforcing this man's will. That's when the sea of angry adults suddenly parted, revealing something that made even Richard's smug expression falter. A boy, no more than 10 years old, was making his way through the crowd on metal crutches that looked older than he was. His left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, encased in a brace held together with duct tape and prayers. His clothes were clean but threadbare, a worn Detroit Lions hoodie that hung loose on his thin frame, jeans with patches over the knees, sneakers with holes that let in the November cold. But it was his eyes that stopped everyone cold. They were dark, intelligent, and filled with something no child should possess, the weight of secrets too heavy for such small shoulders. The boy moved with deliberate purpose, each step calculated despite his disability. The crowd seemed to sense something extraordinary was happening, their shouts dying to whispers, then to complete silence. Even Richard found himself staring, unable to look away from this unlikely figure approaching him. When the boy was close enough that Richard could see the determination etched into his young face, close enough that the billionaire could smell the poverty that clung to him like cologne, the child stopped. He planted his crutches firmly in the broken concrete and looked up, way up, at the man who held the power to destroy or save entire families. "Mr. Hallstrom," the boy said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden stillness. It was a child's voice, but with an adult's certainty, trembling not with fear, but with something else entirely, anticipation. "I know about your daughter." The color drained from Richard's face so quickly it was visible even in the gray morning light. His daughter Emily was his most closely guarded secret, hospitalized for weeks with a mysterious illness that had left her in a medically induced coma. No one outside the family and her medical team knew the severity of her condition. "What did you say?" Richard's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence, everyone heard it. The boy shifted his weight on his crutches, never breaking eye contact. "Emily Hallstrom, 17 years old, St. Mary's Hospital, room 314. She's been unconscious for 19 days. He paused, letting each word sink in like nails in a coffin. "The doctors don't think she's going to wake up." The crowd began to murmur, sensing they were witnessing something beyond their understanding. Richard took a step backward, his face cycling through confusion, fear, and mounting rage. "How could you possibly? Who told you that?" Richard's composure was cracking, his voice rising with each word. The boy's response was delivered with the kind of calm that comes before a storm. "Mr. Hallstrom, if you promise me $1 million, I can cure your daughter." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. 300 adults stood frozen, watching a crippled child face down one of the most powerful men in Michigan. The wind picked up, rattling the factory fence and carrying the distant sound of traffic from the interstate. Richard's shock transformed into something ugly, the kind of laughter that comes not from joy, but from cruelty finding a new target. It started as a chuckle, then built into a full-throated guffaw that echoed off the factory walls. "You?" He laughed, pointing at the boy's twisted leg, his worn clothes, his obvious poverty. "You think you can cure my daughter? Kid, I've got the best doctors money can buy working on this. Harvard-trained specialists, experimental treatments that cost more per day than your family sees in a year." But the boy didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't even seem to hear the mocking tone. Instead, he did something that would haunt Richard's dreams for weeks to come. He smiled. It wasn't a child's innocent smile, but something older, sadder, and infinitely more knowing. "Prepare the check, Mr. Hallstrom," the boy said, his voice carrying a certainty that seemed to chill the very air around them. "When I cure her, you're going to owe me exactly $1 million. The crowd gasped audibly. Even Richard's security team exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't bravado from a desperate child. This was a promise delivered with the confidence of someone who held cards no one else could see. Richard's laughter died abruptly, replaced by something that might have been fear if he were capable of admitting such weakness. He stared down at the boy, trying to understand how a crippled child from the slums could know his most private pain, could speak with such devastating certainty about something impossible. "And what makes you think," Richard said slowly, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "that I would ever trust the most important thing in my life to a—" He gestured dismissively at the boy's appearance. "Because," the boy interrupted, his voice cutting through Richard's words like a blade, "you don't have any other choice. Your daughter is dying, Mr. Hallstrom, and deep down, past all that money and pride, you know it." The silence that followed was absolute. In that moment, the most powerful man in Detroit found himself staring into the eyes of a child who somehow held knowledge that could destroy him, or save the only thing he truly loved. The boy turned to go, his crutches clicking against the concrete with methodical precision. But before he disappeared back into the crowd, he spoke one final time, not looking back, his words carrying on the wind like a prophecy. "My name is Samuel Johnson. When you're ready to save your daughter's life, you'll find me." As the crowd slowly dispersed, Richard stood alone by his Bentley, staring at the empty space where the boy had been. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Hallstrom, a man who controlled the fates of thousands, felt completely powerless. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of metal crutches clicking on concrete faded into the Detroit morning, carrying with it secrets that would change everything. The 30-minute drive back to Grosse Pointe should have been Richard's sanctuary. Leather seats worth more than most people's cars, classical music flowing through a sound system that cost 6 figures, and the familiar comfort of leaving Detroit's decay behind for the manicured perfection of old money. But today, the Bentley felt like a prison cell, and every mile toward home only tightened the invisible noose around his neck. Richard's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, his mind replaying every impossible word that had fallen from the boy's lips. Samuel Johnson. The name echoed in his head like a curse, accompanied by those dark eyes that had seemed to see straight through his soul. How could a crippled child from the worst part of Detroit know about Emily, about room 314, about the 19 days that had become Richard's personal hell? The security at St. Mary's was military grade. He'd made sure of that. Only family, her medical team, and Richard's personal assistant had access to Emily's floor. The media had been completely shut out, paid off, or legally threatened into silence. Even his own board of directors believed his frequent absences were due to routine business matters. Yet somehow, this boy knew details that should have been impossible to obtain. As the Bentley turned onto Lakeshore Drive, the mansions of Michigan's elite came into view, sprawling estates that sat like monuments to accumulated power behind perfectly maintained hedges and electronic gates. Richard's own estate dominated 3 acres of prime lakefront property, a Georgian colonial that had been featured in Architectural Digest twice. But today, even its imposing presence couldn't silence the voice in his head. "Your daughter is dying, Mr. Hallstrom." The boy was right, and that truth cut deeper than any insult the factory workers had hurled at him. Emily had been unconscious for 19 days, her body sustained by machines that hummed and beeped in mechanical sympathy. The best neurologists money could buy spoke in careful medical terminology, but Richard could read between their words. They were running out of options. His beautiful, brilliant daughter, the only pure thing in his corrupted world, was slipping away, and all his billions couldn't buy her back. Richard parked in his circular driveway, but instead of going inside, he sat in the car, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face looked older than it had this morning, lines etched deeper by stress and something he refused to name as fear. The image of Samuel Johnson's twisted leg flashed through his mind, followed immediately by his own cruel laughter. The memory tasted like ash in his mouth. When Richard finally entered his home, the silence was deafening. Margaret, his housekeeper of 15 years, appeared in the foyer with her usual efficiency, but her eyes held the same worried look that had haunted the house since Emily's hospitalization. "Any word from the hospital, sir?" she asked gently, her Irish accent soft with concern. "Nothing new," Richard replied curtly, though the lie felt heavy on his tongue. There had been something new, something impossible that he couldn't share with anyone, because it sounded like the desperate fantasy of a grieving father. Richard retreated to his study, a mahogany-paneled sanctuary lined with first-edition books he'd never read, and awards from charities he'd donated to for tax purposes. He poured himself 3 fingers of Macallan 25, the amber liquid catching the light from his crystal chandelier. The whiskey burned his throat, but it couldn't burn away the image of Samuel's knowing smile. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to Dr. Harrison's number, Emily's lead neurologist, and a man whose expertise had cost Richard more than most people's houses. His finger hovered over the call button for several minutes before he finally pressed it. "Dr. Harrison, it's Richard Hallstrom. I need an update on Emily's condition, and I need complete honesty. No medical euphemisms, no false hope. How much time does she have?" The pause on the other end of the line stretched for an eternity. When Dr. Harrison finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of delivering news no parent should hear. "Mr. Hallstrom, I won't insult your intelligence. The brain swelling hasn't responded to any of our treatments. If we don't see significant improvement in the next few days," another pause, "I think you should prepare yourself for difficult decisions." Richard ended the call without another word, the phone slipping from his numb fingers to land on his desk with a hollow thud. He drained his whiskey in one burning gulp, then immediately poured another. The alcohol wasn't helping. Nothing could numb the realization that his worst nightmare was becoming reality. That's when the boy's words returned with crystalline clarity. "Because you don't have any other choice." Richard walked to his study window, which overlooked Lake St. Clair. The water was grey and choppy, reflecting the November sky like a broken mirror. Somewhere across the city, in a part of Detroit he'd spent his life avoiding, a crippled boy named Samuel Johnson was probably sitting in some run-down house, waiting. Waiting for what? For Richard to swallow his pride and admit that maybe, just maybe, there were things in this world that money couldn't buy or explain. The rational part of his mind, the part that had built an empire through calculated risks and ruthless decision-making, screamed that this was insanity. Children didn't perform miracles. Desperate people didn't suddenly acquire supernatural powers. Yet the other part of his mind, the part that had watched his daughter lying motionless for 19 days, whispered a different truth. What if? Richard's reflection stared back at him from the window, and for the first time in years, he saw not a titan of industry, but a terrified father clinging to the edge of a cliff. Below him lay an abyss he couldn't bear to face, and the only rope being offered came from the most unlikely source imaginable. As darkness began to settle over Grosse Pointe, Richard made a decision that went against every instinct he'd cultivated in 45 years of life. Tomorrow, he would find Samuel Johnson, not because he believed in miracles, but because Dr. Harrison was right. He was running out of time to say goodbye to the only person he'd ever truly loved. The boy had said Richard would find him when he was ready to save his daughter's life. As Richard stared into the gathering darkness, he realized with cold certainty that, ready or not, he was about to discover just how far a desperate father would go to cheat death itself. The call came at 3:47 a.m., piercing through Richard's restless sleep like a knife through silk. He'd been dreaming of Emily as a little girl, running through the mansion's gardens with her golden hair streaming behind her like sunshine. In the dream, she was laughing, that pure, innocent sound that had been absent from his life for far too long. The harsh ring of his phone shattered the illusion, dragging him back to his cold, empty bedroom. "Mr. Hallstrom, Doctor." Harrison's voice was strained, professional composure barely masking what sounded like panic. "You need to get to the hospital immediately. Emily's condition has deteriorated significantly." Richard's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He was already reaching for his clothes before the doctor finished speaking, his hands trembling as he struggled with buttons and zippers. The drive to St. Mary's Hospital passed in a blur of red traffic lights he ignored, and empty streets that seemed to stretch forever. His Bentley's engine roared through the pre-dawn darkness, but no amount of speed could outrun the terror clawing at his chest. St. Mary's Hospital loomed before him like a concrete fortress, its windows glowing with the sterile yellow light that never seemed to bring comfort. Richard burst through the main entrance, his $1,000 shoes squeaking against the polished linoleum as he ran toward the elevators. The night security guard started to say something about visiting hours, but one look at Richard's face silenced him completely. The elevator ride to the third floor felt like descending into hell. Each floor that passed brought him closer to a reality he wasn't prepared to face. When the doors finally opened, Dr. Harrison was waiting, his usually pristine appearance disheveled, his tie loosened, dark circles under his eyes, telling a story of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. "Richard," Dr. Harrison said, and the use of his first name instead of the formal Mr. Hallstrom told Richard everything he needed to know. "The brain swelling has increased dramatically. We've tried everything, increased the medication, additional surgical interventions, experimental treatments. Nothing is working. Her vital signs are—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't completely destroy a father's heart. "We're looking at hours, not days." The hallway began to spin around Richard. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to flicker and blur, casting strange shadows that danced on the walls like demons. He grabbed the nearest wall for support, his legs suddenly feeling like they were made of water. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the steady beep of monitors, the whispered conversations of nurses, the mechanical breathing of ventilators keeping people alive who should have already died. "I want to see her," Richard whispered, his voice barely audible. Dr. Harrison led him down the corridor to room 314, each step feeling like a march toward his own execution. The room was a symphony of medical technology, machines that beeped and hummed and displayed numbers that meant the difference between life and death. IV lines snaked from bags of clear fluid to Emily's arms, while electrodes monitored her heart rhythm in steady green lines across multiple screens. But it was Emily herself who nearly brought Richard to his knees. His beautiful daughter lay motionless beneath crisp white sheets, her face pale as porcelain, her golden hair spread across the pillow like spun silk. A ventilator covered the lower half of her face, breathing for her in mechanical rhythm. She looked so small, so fragile, nothing like the vibrant teenager who had argued with him about college choices just a month ago. Richard approached her bedside on unsteady legs, reaching out with trembling fingers to touch her hand. Her skin was warm but unresponsive, and the lack of reaction to his touch hit him like a physical blow. This was his daughter, his brilliant, stubborn, beautiful daughter, and she was slipping away from him one breath at a time. "Emily," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Daddy's here, sweetheart. I'm so sorry I wasn't here sooner. I'm sorry for everything." Tears he hadn't shed since childhood began to blur his vision, hot and shameful on his cheeks. "Doctor," Harrison cleared his throat softly. "Richard, I need to discuss some options with you. We can keep her comfortable, or—" He trailed off, unable to voice the alternative that hung in the air like a death sentence. Richard couldn't speak. His throat felt like it was closing, his chest tight with a pain he'd never experienced. This was worse than any business loss, any financial setback, any professional humiliation. This was his heart being ripped from his chest while he watched helplessly. That's when Samuel Johnson's words echoed through his mind with devastating clarity. "Because you don't have any other choice. Your daughter is dying, Mr. Hallstrom. And deep down, past all that money and pride, you know it." The boy had been right. All of Richard's wealth, all of his power, all of his connections and influence meant absolutely nothing in this sterile room where machines kept his daughter breathing. He was just another desperate father watching his child die, no different from any of the workers he'd dismissed so casually. "Dr. Harrison," Richard said suddenly, his voice gaining strength from desperation, What if there was someone else? Someone who might be able to help?" The doctor's expression was gentle but firm. "Richard, I understand you're grasping for hope, but we've consulted with the best specialists in the country. There's nothing more that medical science can do." But Richard wasn't thinking about medical science anymore. He was thinking about a crippled boy who had known impossible things, who had spoken with the certainty of someone holding secrets that could change everything. Against every rational thought in his head, against every principle he'd lived by, Richard found himself clinging to the memory of Samuel's knowing smile. "I need to make a phone call," Richard said abruptly, pulling out his cell phone with shaking hands. As he scrolled through his contacts looking for his private investigator's number, Richard caught his reflection in the room's darkened window. The man staring back at him looked broken, defeated, nothing like the corporate titan who had laughed at a crippled child just yesterday. Tomorrow, he would find Samuel Johnson, not because he believed in miracles, but because facing the impossible seemed preferable to accepting the inevitable. His daughter was dying, and a 10-year-old boy with metal crutches had somehow become his last desperate hope. The irony wasn't lost on him. The most powerful man in Detroit was about to place his faith in the hands of a child he'd mocked. But as Richard looked at Emily's still face, he realized that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Richard's private investigator, Marcus Chen, was the kind of man who could find anyone, anywhere, at any time. For 20 years, he'd tracked down corporate espionage, located missing persons, and dug up dirt on Richard's business rivals with the precision of a surgeon and the discretion of a priest. But when Richard called him at dawn with instructions to find a 10-year-old boy named Samuel Johnson in Detroit's East Side, even Marcus seemed taken aback. "A kid, Mr. Hallstrom. What's this about?" "Just find him," Richard had snapped, his voice hoarse from hours of watching Emily's motionless form. "And Marcus, I need this today, not tomorrow, not next week. Today." By noon, Marcus had called back with an address that made Richard's stomach turn: 8247 Mack Avenue, a street that Google Street View showed as a wasteland of boarded-up houses, vacant lots filled with weeds, and buildings that looked like they were held together by spray paint and prayer. This was the Detroit that existed in the shadows of his corporate empire, the part of the city that his factories had abandoned, his policies had neglected, his very presence had helped destroy. Richard drove there himself, despite Marcus's offer to escort him. The Bentley felt obscene as it rolled through neighborhoods where children played in streets littered with broken glass and grown men sat on stoops at midday because there were no jobs to go to. The contrast was so stark, it felt like traveling between different planets, from the manicured lawns of Grosse Pointe to the urban decay of East Detroit in 30 minutes. Number 8247 was a small wooden house that might have been yellow once, though weather and neglect had faded it to the color of old bones. The front porch sagged under the weight of too many harsh winters, and the windows were covered with plastic sheeting that fluttered in the November wind like surrender flags. A rusty wheelchair ramp had been built alongside the front steps, constructed from mismatched lumber that spoke of desperate improvisation rather than professional installation. Richard sat in his car for 10 minutes, engine running, staring at the house where Samuel Johnson lived. This was where the boy who claimed he could save Emily called home, a place that looked like it might collapse if someone slammed a door too hard. The irony was bitter in his mouth. He was about to beg for help from someone who clearly needed help themselves. When he finally knocked on the front door, it was answered by an elderly black woman whose weathered face told a story of decades lived without cushioning from life's harder edges. She was small, but carried herself with the dignity of someone who had faced down worse things than billionaires on her doorstep. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a faded housecoat over a Detroit Pistons t-shirt that had seen better years. "You must be Mr. Hallstrom," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had been expecting this moment. "I'm Rose Johnson, Samuel's grandmother. He told me you'd come." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Standing on this sagging porch, facing this woman who radiated more grace in her poverty than he'd ever possessed in his wealth, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: shame. Not the corporate embarrassment of a failed merger or the social discomfort of being caught in a lie, but real, bone-deep shame at who he was and what he'd become. Mrs. Johnson, he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to speak with Samuel. Please, it's about my daughter. Rose studied his face for a long moment, her dark eyes seeing through the expensive suit and practiced arrogance to something more vulnerable underneath. Samuel's been waiting for you, she said simply, stepping aside to let him enter. The inside of the house was a revelation. Despite the poverty that marked every surface, furniture held together with duct tape, a television that belonged in a museum, walls that needed painting they couldn't afford. The home radiated warmth and love in a way Richard's mansion never had. Family photographs covered every available space, showing generations of Johnsons who had lived and loved and struggled in this little house. The smell of something delicious wafted from the kitchen, and Richard realized with a start that this was what a real home felt like. Samuel was sitting at a small table by the window, drawing in a notebook with a pencil worn down to almost nothing. When he looked up at Richard, there was no surprise in his dark eyes, no triumph at seeing the mighty billionaire humbled. There was only a sadness that seemed far too old for his young face. Your daughter got worse last night, didn't she? Samuel said quietly, setting down his pencil with careful precision. Richard's composure finally cracked completely. The tears he'd been holding back since Dr. Harrison's call broke free, and he found himself crying in front of strangers in a house that cost less than his monthly car payment. Yes, he sobbed, the word torn from somewhere deep in his chest. She's dying. The doctors say there's nothing they can do. Samuel nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already known. Sit down, Mr. Hallstrom. We need to talk. Richard collapsed into a chair that creaked under his weight, his hands shaking as he tried to wipe away tears that wouldn't stop coming. Through his blurred vision, he could see Rose moving quietly in the background, preparing tea with the automatic grace of someone who had comforted many broken souls in this small kitchen. My grandson has a gift, Rose said softly, placing a chipped mug of steaming tea in front of Richard. Not magic, not miracles, just something special he inherited from his daddy. But gifts come with prices, Mr. Hallstrom. And sometimes the price isn't what you expect. Samuel reached across the table and placed his small hand over Richard's much larger one. The touch was gentle, warm, and somehow Richard felt a calmness he hadn't experienced in weeks. I can help your daughter, the boy said, his voice carrying that same impossible certainty from the factory gates. But first, you need to understand something important. This isn't about your money. This never was about your money. Richard looked into Samuel's eyes and saw something that terrified him more than Emily's illness, more than the prospect of losing everything he'd built. He saw judgment. Not the harsh condemnation of an enemy, but the gentle, implacable judgment of truth itself. What do you want from me? Richard whispered. Samuel's answer would haunt him for the rest of his life. I want you to remember what it feels like to be human. The drive from Samuel's house to St. Mary's Hospital felt like a journey between two different universes. Richard gripped the steering wheel of his Bentley while Samuel sat in the passenger seat, his metal crutches propped carefully between his legs, staring out at the city that had shaped both their lives in such drastically different ways. The boy's presence filled the car with a strange energy, not the nervous excitement of a child on an adventure, but the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were walking into. Tell me about Emily, Samuel said softly as they passed the Renaissance Center, Detroit's glass towers reaching toward a gray November sky. Not the medical stuff. Tell me who she really is. Richard's hands tightened on the wheel. He'd spent weeks discussing Emily's condition with doctors, reviewing test results and treatment options, but no one had asked him to simply talk about his daughter as a person. He began, then stopped, surprised by how difficult it was to find the right words. She's brilliant, stubborn as hell. Gets that from me, I suppose. She wants to be a doctor, actually. Pediatric neurology. A ghost of a smile crossed Samuel's face. She wants to help kids like me. Yes, Richard whispered, the irony cutting deep. His daughter dreamed of healing children while he had spent his life stepping over them to climb higher. When they arrived at St. Mary's, the contrast between the two figures walking through the lobby was stark enough to draw stares. Richard Hallstrom, in his tailored wool coat and Italian leather shoes, moving with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Beside him, Samuel Johnson, a small boy whose clothes had seen better days, making his way slowly but determinedly on metal crutches that clicked against the polished floor with each step. The elevator ride to the third floor was filled with tension so thick it seemed to have physical weight. Richard's mind raced with questions he was afraid to ask. What if this was all an elaborate hoax? What if Samuel was just a desperate child who had somehow learned about Emily and was trying to exploit a grieving father? What if Richard had finally lost his mind completely? But when they reached Emily's room, and Samuel saw her lying motionless beneath the web of medical equipment, something shifted in the boy's expression. The confident certainty that had carried him this far was replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. For the first time since Richard had met him, Samuel looked like what he was, a 10-year-old child facing something enormous and frightening. "She's beautiful," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible over the steady rhythm of the ventilator. "I can see why you love her so much." Doctor Harrison appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of professional concern mixed with barely concealed confusion. "Mr. Hallstrom, who is this child? Visiting hours are restricted, and Emily's condition is—" "This is Samuel Johnson," Richard interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "He's here to help Emily." Dr. Harrison's eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. "Mr. Hallstrom, I understand you're going through an incredibly difficult time, but bringing children into the ICU is highly irregular. And if you're thinking about some kind of alternative therapy, let me try," Samuel said quietly, his words cutting through the adult conversation like a knife through silk. Both men turned to look at him, and in that moment, something in the boy's eyes silenced all objections. It wasn't arrogance or childish stubbornness, but a depth of purpose that seemed impossible in someone so young. "Doctor." Harrison looked from Samuel to Richard, clearly struggling between medical protocol and the desperate hope he could see in a father's eyes. 5 minutes, he said finally. But I'm staying in the room, and if there's any change in her vital signs—" "There will be," Samuel said with quiet certainty. "That's the point." Samuel approached Emily's bedside slowly, his crutches making soft clicking sounds against the linoleum floor. When he reached her, he set the crutches aside and carefully sat on the edge of the hospital bed, his twisted leg hanging at an awkward angle. Richard held his breath, afraid that any sound might break whatever spell was about to unfold. Samuel placed his small hands on either side of Emily's face, his palms barely spanning her cheeks. His touch was gentle, reverent, like he was handling something infinitely precious. Then he began to speak, his voice so low that Richard had to strain to hear the words. "Emily," Samuel whispered, "my name is Samuel, and I know you're scared. I know you're lost in the dark and you can't find your way back to your daddy. But I'm here to help you. I know what it's like to be different, to have something wrong with your body that makes everything harder. But that doesn't mean you have to give up." As Samuel spoke, something extraordinary began to happen. The monitors that had been beeping with mechanical regularity started to show subtle changes. Emily's heart rate, which had been steady but weak, began to strengthen. Her brain activity, which had been minimal for days, showed small but definite spikes of increased function. Dr. Harrison moved closer to the monitors, his face a mask of disbelief. "This is impossible," he muttered, checking and rechecking the readings. "Her neural activity is increasing. How is this?" "Because she can hear him," Richard said suddenly, understanding flooding through him like a revelation. "She's been waiting for someone to talk to her like she's still there." Samuel continued his gentle monologue, telling Emily about his grandmother's cooking, about the books he read by the window in their small house, about the dreams he had of walking without crutches someday. He spoke to her not as a patient to be cured, but as one human being reaching out to another across the darkness that separated them. Then, as they all watched in stunned silence, Emily's eyelids fluttered. It was the smallest movement, barely perceptible, but in that sterile room, filled with the desperate hopes of a father and the impossible faith of a crippled boy, it felt like witnessing the birth of a star. "Emily," Richard whispered, moving to the other side of the bed, tears streaming down his face. "Sweetheart, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, blinking against the harsh hospital lights. When her gaze finally settled on Richard's face, the smile that spread across her lips was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the ventilator tube that had been removed just moments before. "What happened? Who is this boy?" Richard looked across the bed at Samuel, who was smiling through his own tears, his hands still gently resting on Emily's face. In that moment, Richard understood that he had witnessed something that had nothing to do with medicine or science or any rational explanation. He had seen love in its purest form, the willingness of one broken soul to reach out and heal another, asking for nothing in return except the chance to make a difference. "This is Samuel," Richard said, his voice thick with emotions he couldn't name. "He's the boy who brought you back to me." The following days at St. Mary's Hospital felt like living inside a miracle that Richard couldn't quite believe was real. Emily's recovery defied every medical explanation Dr. Harrison and his team could offer. Her brain function had not only returned to normal levels, but seemed sharper, more focused than before her illness. The swelling that had threatened her life had reduced dramatically, and her cognitive responses were testing better than they had in years. But it was more than just the medical miracle that left Richard reeling. It was watching the friendship that blossomed between his daughter and Samuel Johnson. Emily, who had always been somewhat sheltered in her privileged world, was drawn to Samuel with an intensity that both fascinated and worried her father. The boy would arrive each morning around 9, navigating the hospital corridors with his metal crutches, carrying a worn backpack filled with books and drawings that he shared with Emily during their long conversations. "He's not like anyone I've ever met, Dad," Emily told Richard on her 4th day of consciousness, her voice still weak but gaining strength with each hour. "He sees things differently. When I was away, I could hear him talking to me. He was the only voice that cut through the darkness." Richard sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair that had become his second home, watching his daughter's animated face as she spoke about Samuel. There was a light in her eyes that had been missing for months before her illness. Not just health returning, but something deeper. Purpose, perhaps, or understanding. "What do you two talk about for hours?" Richard asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Emily's expression grew thoughtful, mature beyond her 17 years. "He tells me about his life, about his grandmother, about growing up in a world so different from mine. But Dad," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "he also tells me about you, about things that happened before I was born, things I think you need to tell me yourself." A chill ran down Richard's spine. "What kind of things?" Before Emily could answer, Samuel appeared in the doorway, his arrival announced by the familiar rhythm of his crutches against the linoleum floor. But today, something was different about the boy. His usual quiet confidence seemed strained, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Good morning, Emily," Samuel said, his voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that didn't quite mask an underlying tension. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Emily replied, but her eyes were studying Samuel's face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read people during her brief but intense friendship with him. "Sam, what's wrong? You look like you haven't slept." Samuel lowered himself into the visitor's chair with more difficulty than usual, his movements stiff and pained. "I'm fine," he said, but the lie was transparent. "Just tired." Richard had been watching this exchange with growing unease. In the days since Samuel had somehow awakened Emily from her coma, Richard had been so focused on his daughter's recovery that he hadn't thought much about the boy himself. Now, looking at Samuel's pallor and the way he seemed to be struggling more than usual with his crutches, a terrible possibility began to form in Richard's mind. "Samuel," Richard said slowly, when you helped Emily, did something happen to you?" The boy's dark eyes flicked toward Richard, and in that brief glance, Richard saw confirmation of his worst fears. Samuel was paying a price for Emily's healing, not the $1 million that had been promised, but something far more precious. "It doesn't work that way," Samuel said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing that's worth having comes without cost. I knew that when I offered to help." Emily sat up straighter in her hospital bed, alarm spreading across her face. "Sam, what are you talking about? What cost?" Samuel's smile was sad but genuine. "My leg's been getting worse since that first day. The doctors at the free clinic say the bone disease is spreading faster now. They think I might need—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Amputation," Richard said, the word falling like a stone into the silence of the room. Samuel nodded, his small hands gripping the arms of his chair until his knuckles turned white. "It's okay," he said, though his voice shook slightly. "Emily was dying. I was already sick. At least this way something good came from it." Richard felt like the air had been sucked from his lungs. This child, this brave, impossible child, had somehow transferred Emily's mortal peril to himself. The boy who had appeared at the factory gates like an angel of judgment had sacrificed his own health to save Richard's daughter, and he was acting like it was the most natural thing in the world. "No," Richard said, his voice gaining strength and determination. "Absolutely not. I won't let you pay that price for my daughter's life." Samuel looked at him with something approaching pity. "Mr. Hallstrom, you can't control everything with money. Some things just are what they are." But Richard was already standing, his mind racing through possibilities. The best orthopedic surgeons in the world, experimental treatments, whatever it costs. "Dad, stop." Emily's voice cut through his desperate planning. "Look at him, really look at him." Richard forced himself to focus on Samuel's face, and what he saw there stopped him cold. The boy wasn't afraid, wasn't asking for rescue or pity. There was a peace in his expression that Richard had never seen before. The calm of someone who had made a choice and accepted its consequences without regret. "I didn't save your daughter, so you could try to save me," Samuel said gently. "I did it because it was the right thing to do, because someone needed to show you that not everything in this world is a transaction." The weight of Samuel's words hit Richard like a physical blow. This child had given everything he had, literally everything, not for money or recognition or reward, but simply because it was right. In a world where Richard had built his fortune on calculated advantage and ruthless self-interest, Samuel had acted with pure, selfless love. "But why?" Richard whispered, his voice breaking. "Why would you sacrifice yourself for people you barely know?" Samuel's answer was simple, devastating in its honesty. "Because my daddy taught me that sometimes the only way to beat the darkness is to light a candle, even if it burns you up." For the first time in his adult life, Richard Hallstrom understood what it meant to be truly humbled. This crippled boy from the poorest part of Detroit had shown him a kind of courage and grace that all his wealth and power could never buy. And in doing so, Samuel had revealed the bankruptcy of everything Richard had built his life upon. Emily reached across the space between their beds and took Samuel's hand in hers. "Then we'll face whatever comes next together," she said firmly. "All three of us." Richard looked at his daughter and the boy who had saved her and realized that his real education was just beginning. The emergency surgery alarm pierced through St. Ewe, Mary's Hospital at 2:15 a.m. on a cold December morning, 3 weeks after Emily's miraculous recovery. Richard had been sleeping fitfully in the reclining chair beside his daughter's bed when the sound jolted him awake. with a terror that reached into his bones. But it wasn't Emily's monitors that were screaming. It was coming from somewhere else in the hospital, echoing through corridors that had become as familiar to him as his own home. Dr. Harrison burst into the room, his face pale with urgency. "Richard, it's Samuel. His condition has deteriorated rapidly. We need to operate immediately, but—" He paused, struggling with words that no doctor should have to say. His grandmother is his legal guardian, and she's refusing to sign the consent forms. She says she can't afford the surgery, and she won't let us perform a procedure that will leave her family in debt for the rest of their lives. Richard was on his feet before Dr. Harrison finished speaking, his heart pounding with a mixture of panic and determination that he'd never experienced before. "Where is he?" "In operating prep room B, but Richard, you need to understand, even with surgery, the chances of saving his leg are minimal. The bone disease has progressed too far. We're looking at amputation above the knee, and even then—" Richard didn't wait to hear the rest. He ran through the hospital corridors, his expensive shoes slipping on the polished floors, past startled nurses and security guards who called after him but didn't dare to stop a man whose donations had funded an entire wing of the hospital. When he reached the prep room, he found a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Samuel lay on a gurney, his small body dwarfed by the medical equipment surrounding him. His face was gray with pain, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air of the room. But it was the sight of Rose Johnson that nearly brought Richard to his knees. The elderly woman sat beside her grandson, holding his hand with both of hers, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she whispered prayers in a voice broken by impossible choices. "Mrs. Johnson," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper as he approached them. "Please let me help." And Rose looked up at him with eyes that held decades of disappointment, with promises that were never kept, hope that had been crushed too many times to trust again. "Mr. Hallstrom, this surgery will cost more than I'll see in 10 lifetimes. I won't leave my grandson with debt that will follow him for the rest of his life, however long that might be." Richard fell to his knees beside the gurney, no longer caring about dignity or appearances, or what anyone might think of a billionaire begging in a hospital prep room. "Mrs. Johnson, your grandson saved my daughter's life. He gave everything he had, asked for nothing in return. Please let me do this one thing. Let me pay for the surgery." Samuel's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Richard with effort that was painful to watch. "Mr. Hallstrom," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the medical equipment. "The money won't change anything. The doctors already told Grandma Rose, even with surgery, they can't save my leg." "No, then we'll get you the best prosthetic money can buy," Richard said desperately, tears he didn't try to hide streaming down his face. "We'll get you the best physical therapists, the best rehabilitation." "That's not what I need," Samuel interrupted gently, his small hand reaching out to touch Richard's face with surprising strength. "What I need is for you to promise me something." Richard grasped Samuel's hand in both of his, feeling how fragile and cold it was. "Anything, name it." Samuel's eyes moved to look past Richard, and when Richard turned, he saw Emily standing in the doorway. She had discharged herself from her room against medical advice, wearing a hospital gown and dragging an IV pole behind her, her face determined despite her obvious weakness. "I need you to promise," Samuel said, his voice gaining clarity despite his pain, "that you'll remember what it feels like to be powerless. That you'll remember that all the money in the world can't buy back time, can't undo the hurt you've caused, can't make right the wrongs you've done to people like my family." Richard's throat closed completely. He wanted to speak, to make promises, to fix everything with the brute force of his wealth, but Samuel wasn't finished. "My daddy died in your factory, Mr. Hallstrom. Not from an accident, from despair. You fired him for trying to protect the other workers, blacklisted him so he couldn't find work anywhere else. He died of a heart attack at 32 because he couldn't feed his family, couldn't afford his medication, couldn't see a future where things would get better." The words hit Richard like physical blows. He remembered now, vaguely, distantly, like a half-forgotten nightmare. Thomas Johnson, a troublemaker who had tried to organize the workers, who had filed safety complaints, who had cost the company money with his demands for better working conditions. Richard had crushed him like he'd crushed dozens of others, never thinking about the human cost of his decisions. "Samuel," Richard whispered, his voice breaking completely. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know, I never thought—" "You never thought about us at all," Samuel said, but there was no anger in his voice, only a sadness that seemed to encompass the weight of the world. "We were just numbers on a spreadsheet to you, but we're people, Mr. Hallstrom. We have families, dreams, fears. We matter." Emily had made her way to the gurney, her own IV pole clattering against the medical equipment. She took Samuel's other hand in hers, her face wet with tears. "Sam, you don't have to do this. You don't have to forgive him." Samuel smiled at her with a peace that seemed impossible under the circumstances. "Yes, I do, Emily, because forgiveness isn't about him. It's about me. It's about choosing love over hate, hope over despair. It's what my daddy would have wanted." Richard understood then that he was witnessing something sacred, something that had nothing to do with medical procedures or financial transactions. This dying boy was offering him a gift that he had never deserved and could never repay, the chance at redemption. "I promise," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion he had never allowed himself to feel. "I promise to remember. I promise to be better. I promise to use what I have to help instead of hurt." Samuel's smile grew brighter, and for a moment the pain seemed to leave his face entirely. "Then prepare that check, Mr. Hallstrom, because you're about to get something worth far more than $1 million. As the surgical team wheeled Samuel toward the operating room, Richard realized that the boy was right. He was about to receive something priceless, the chance to become human again. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning in Detroit, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in what felt like years, casting golden light across the newly renovated factory floor of what was now called Johnson Hallstrom Manufacturing. The irony wasn't lost on Richard. As he stood before a podium, facing nearly 500 workers, many of them the same people who had shouted curses at him outside these very gates just months ago. Today, they listened with a mixture of skepticism and cautious hope as he prepared to announce something that would have been unthinkable in his former life. Emily stood beside him, radiant in her recovery, wearing a simple blue dress that made her look older than her 17 years. The experience of nearly dying and then witnessing Samuel's sacrifice had changed her fundamentally. Gone was the sheltered rich girl who had taken her privileges for granted. In her place stood a young woman who understood the weight of second chances and the responsibility that came with unearned grace. But it was the figure in the front row that drew Richard's attention and steadied his nerves. Samuel Johnson sat in a state-of-the-art wheelchair, his left leg amputated above the knee, as the doctors had predicted. The prosthetic leg that would eventually replace it was still weeks away, but Samuel seemed unbothered by the delay. His dark eyes held the same quiet wisdom they'd always possessed, though now there was something else there too. A deep satisfaction, as if he had accomplished exactly what he'd set out to do. Beside Samuel sat Rose Johnson, wearing a new dress that Emily had insisted on buying for her, though the older woman's dignity had never needed any enhancement. Her weathered hands rested proudly on her grandson's shoulders, and when she caught Richard's eye, she nodded once, a gesture of forgiveness that he knew he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve. 6 months ago, Richard began, his voice carrying clearly across the factory floor through a sound system that had cost more than most of these workers' annual salaries. I stood outside these gates as a very different man. I was someone who believed that wealth meant worth, that power justified cruelty, that the accident of my birth made me inherently better than the people who actually built the things that made me rich. A murmur went through the crowd. This was not the kind of speech they'd expected from Richard Hallstrom. Not an announcement of new policies or productivity targets, but something that sounded dangerously close to a confession. "I was wrong," Richard continued, his voice gaining strength from the simple honesty of the admission. "I was not just wrong, I was evil. I destroyed families, ruined lives, crushed dreams under the weight of my arrogance and greed. I told myself it was just business, just the way the world worked, but that was a lie I told myself to sleep at night." Richard's eyes found Samuel's face in the crowd, drawing courage from the boy's encouraging smile. "A 10-year-old child had to teach me what it meant to be human. A boy who had every reason to hate me instead chose to save what I love most in this world. He gave up his leg, his mobility, his future as I had imagined it, to show me that love is stronger than hate, that grace is more powerful than revenge." Emily stepped forward then, taking the microphone with the poise of someone who had grown up in the public eye, but was now using that skill for something that actually mattered. "My father asked me to speak today because he said the words needed to come from someone who understands what we almost lost. I almost died, and in those dark weeks when I was unconscious, I could hear everything that was happening around me. I heard the doctors tell my father that there was no hope. I heard him cry in ways that I had never heard before." Her voice broke slightly, but she pressed on, her love for both her father and Samuel giving her strength. "But I also heard Samuel's voice, cutting through that darkness like a lighthouse beam. He talked to me not like I was a patient or a victim, but like I was a person worth saving. He gave me his strength when I had none left, and he asked for nothing in return except the chance to make my father remember how to love." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Even the reporters who had been invited to document this unprecedented moment had stopped taking notes, caught up in a story that was bigger than business news or corporate restructuring. Richard took the microphone back, his hands steady for the first time in months. "Today, I'm announcing that 51% of the ownership of this company is being transferred to a worker ownership trust. Every person who works here will have a voice in how this company is run, a share in its profits, and the security of knowing that their jobs will never again depend on the whims of someone who has never walked in their shoes." The silence stretched for a heartbeat, then two, before erupting into something that started as applause and grew into something approaching a roar. But Richard wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he said, waiting for the noise to subside, "we're establishing the Thomas Johnson Memorial Fund for worker safety and family support, with an initial endowment of $50 million. No family will ever again face the choice between medical care and financial ruin. No worker will ever again be punished for speaking up about unsafe conditions." Through the cheering crowd, Richard could see Samuel wiping tears from his eyes, not tears of sadness, but of joy so pure it seemed to light up his entire face. The boy had gotten something infinitely more valuable than the $1 million Richard had promised. He had gotten justice, not just for himself and his family, but for every worker who had ever been ground down by the machinery of unchecked corporate power. When the celebration finally died down, Richard made his way through the crowd to where Samuel waited. The boy looked up at him with eyes that held no triumph, no sense of victory over a defeated enemy. Instead, there was only love. The kind of unconditional, transformative love that Richard was only beginning to understand. "So," Richard said, kneeling beside Samuel's wheelchair so they could speak face to face, "about that check you mentioned." Samuel's laugh was like music, bright and clean, and filled with a joy that seemed to infect everyone around him. "I think we can call it even, Mr. Hallstrom. Besides, the best things in life can't be bought with money." Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out a cashier's check for $1 million, made out to Samuel Johnson, but instead of handing it over, he tore it in half, then into quarters, letting the pieces fall like confetti to the factory floor. "You're absolutely right," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "The best things in life are free, and you, Samuel Johnson, have given me the most valuable gift of all, the chance to become the man I should have been all along. As the crowd cheered and Emily hugged them both, Richard realized that this wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning. The first day of a life lived not for the accumulation of wealth, but for the creation of hope. And it had all started with a crippled boy who had the courage to believe that even the hardest hearts could learn to love again. The end. Sometimes the greatest miracles come not from divine intervention, but from the courage of a broken soul, choosing love over hatred. Samuel Johnson could have used his knowledge to destroy Richard Hallstrom, to expose his secrets and watch him fall. Instead, this 10-year-old boy chose to save the daughter of the man who had killed his father, trading his own mobility for the chance to teach a billionaire what it truly means to be human. Ask yourself honestly, if you had lost everything because of someone's greed, would you have the strength to forgive? Would you sacrifice your own future to save theirs? Richard Hallstrom's transformation reminds us that no one is beyond redemption, but the path to forgiveness often requires losing everything we thought made us valuable. His wealth couldn't save his daughter, his power couldn't buy Samuel's healing, and his pride nearly cost him the most important lesson of his life. In the end, it took a crippled child to show him that true strength isn't measured by what you can take from others, but by what you're willing to give when you have nothing left to lose. The real question isn't whether Richard deserved Samuel's grace. It's whether we have the courage to show that same unconditional love to those who have hurt us. This story proves that the most powerful force in the universe isn't money, fame, or influence. It's the choice to respond to cruelty with kindness, to hatred with love, and to despair with hope. If this story touched your heart and made you reflect on your own capacity for forgiveness, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. Follow our channel for more stories that will challenge your heart and change your perspective on what it truly means to live with purpose.